Welcome. You're listening to a 2019 Right On Con podcast. This is Sue Stanley from the Right On Con team. I'm so thrilled to speak with author Joey Weiser about graphic novels today. Joey, thank you so much for joining me.
All right. Thanks for having me.
For those of you who may not know, Joey Weiser is the author of middle grade Merman graphic novels. Joey, can you tell us a bit about yourself?
Sure. I'm a cartoonist currently living in Athens, Georgia. I grew up in Indiana, and yeah, as you said, I just wrapped up a 5-book graphic novel series aimed at middle grade readers called Merman. That's about a fish boy. It's a comedic adventure series. And coming out in May, I'll have a new book called Ghost Hog. That's a standalone graphic novel aimed at a similar audience.
That's very exciting. How long did it take you to develop your style, the style of your graphic novels and the art that you use?
Yeah. Well, if we're talking about like art style, like a lot of people say will categorize my art as cartoony, or I see like people often will say they look like Saturday morning cartoons or something, which it's
Mhm.
kind of hard to say exactly what that means, other than maybe I grew up in the 80s and 90s and it reflects those cartoons that I grew up watching or something. But what I always say about I know people that are can consciously change their art style for what project they're doing and stuff. But for me, I always say that my drawing style is like handwriting. It's just kind of after years and years of doing it, it's just the way that it comes out. And that comes from a lot of different influences and practicing different ways and stuff. But really, it's kind of unconscious. And then as for the writing style, I didn't always intend to write for younger readers, but I just tried to make comics that were fun to make and with the idea that they would be also fun to read. And then they started being categorized as like all ages or younger readers or something like that. And once that was that label started kind of being put on the work that I was producing, it was easier to lean sort of in that direction and say like, okay, well, maybe like with the Merman series, it was a conscious decision to say like, well, maybe I'll have all the main characters be young kids, and and things like that. But to a large extent, for like style wise, I let sort of my subconscious do the work.
Oh, it's great. It's really they're charming. They're absolutely
Oh,
charming,
thank you.
by the way, your art and the stories themselves. Um, it seemed to me as I looked through them that you have a really important message that you're trying to deliver with the Merman series in particular. And I wondered if that was something that you came to, that you decided to do at the beginning, or if that evolved as you told the story.
That's something that's sort of evolved on its own. I think when I first started writing, I just had sort of a basic concept that it would be fun to do a story about like a fish boy, and then sort of the idea of like, well, maybe it would be fun to have him on land to sort of play with opposites. And these little tiny bits and pieces of the story started coming together. And then once I start kind of asking myself these questions of like, why is he on land? If the kids have never human kids have never seen fish creatures before, why is that? And things like that, and little bits and pieces of the story start coming together, and then I can almost look back on it at that point and say, well, okay, what are the themes that I'm starting to play with? And so these themes of like responsibility and accepting others and things like that just kind of happen naturally. And once I can start seeing those, I can write towards that. But it always comes out a lot more stilted if I say, okay, I'm going to write a story about this theme. It always ends up being a little more forced than I like.
That makes a lot of sense. That makes a lot of sense. When you start writing, do you start with words or do you start with pictures? In your mind, does it come to you as words or does it come to you as pictures or both?
It's actually kind of both, yeah. So, in comics, there's, especially in American comics, with the history of the way that like superhero books are produced, there's a lot of like history of people. One person takes the writing, one person does the drawing, that kind of thing. But for the kind of comics that I make, I would say that I'm uh, what I would call a cartoonist, which is someone who does both the writing and the drawing, and it really is a different thing than just writing or just drawing, and they work together. So, I tried in the past to write. Sometimes when people write for comics, they write like script style, where they
Mhm.
write something that looks like a movie script or something. And I tried that, and I always spent so long, so much mental energy, kind of imagining the page and trying to figure out how much would fit on a page and what panel would be best to be big and stuff. I realized I should just sketch it out. And so when I'm writing, after doing like a series of outlines and stuff to kind of figure out that I have everything in place, the real writing happens when I'm sketching in my sketchbook and drawing the characters and drawing them speaking, because I can really like imagine them coming to life, and they do a lot of acting there on the page. So it really is a pretty separate muscle than just writing or drawing.
Do they ever surprise you? Do your characters ever surprise you?
Yeah, that does happen. I think that I have tried to force personalities on characters that just doesn't work out that way, which is a kind of funny thing. But just when once I start drawing those characters, it is something that I'm creating, but um, things start playing out in ways that I don't necessarily expect. I really, with Ghost Hog, had originally pictured the main character Truff as being this very grumpy. All of my first sketches of her were this very grumpy little character. And I really was kind of imagining that to begin with. And then as I was writing the story, I think maybe I was a little more sympathetic towards her than I was expecting. And so these sort of categorization of her being very grumpy and angry and negative all the time, is still there a little bit, but it starts to kind of get eroded away as I was actually drawing her story. And that surprised me for sure, because that's not what I was planning. I was kind of planning for her to be a bit of an opposite for the merman character who I'd been working with for so many years, who was just like sort of a somewhat ignorant, glowing beam of optimism in a lot of ways.
That's really interesting. Is what is it you mentioned at the beginning that you kind of fell into writing for middle grade because
Hmm.
of the way you draw and what your characters look like as you draw. Is that does it appeal to you now that you're there, and what about writing for that age group appeals to you the most?
Yeah, when I was first starting out, when I was like in college and I was experimenting with all sorts of different types of comics and stuff, I tried to make comics. I think for a while I was really drawn, being sort of a upper age, teenager, early 20s. I was drawn to sort of more, I don't know, sarcastic or cynical viewpoints, and I was trying to make comics with that viewpoint. And then one day I just drew a comic that was just a silly comic about dinosaurs finding a magic lamp, and it was just like silly and fun, and it was like this weird weight had been lifted off my chest, and I was like, oh, feels really good to like make fun comics that are really fun and in a sort of spirit that I think then gets sort of categorized as being more for kids or something like that. And so um so yeah, it wasn't originally my plan, but once I realized that that's the way I like to make comics, and it actually makes me feel good to make comics like that. I love it, and I still do read a lot of comics aimed at younger kids and stuff. Not just for the sort of reason of kind of knowing what else is out there and knowing what publishers are into and stuff, but just because it's fun to read.
Mhm. Yeah, they are fun to read. I've enjoyed them looking at yours and going through them and others as well. Um, You have 5 in the Merman series. Are
Hmm.
you and you have said that it's complete. Do you
Hmm.
think that you will ever go back? Do any of those characters draw or pull at you, still, or are you, sure you're done with that
Hmm.
world?
Yeah. So when I first was speaking with my publisher, Oni Press, about doing the Merman books, I pitched them this 5 book idea, and the idea of the 5th book was just so like distant in the future that I didn't think I'd ever get there. And then I just, over the years was working, 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 and then eventually I was on that last book. And thankfully, I wasn't at a point where I was so sick of working on it that I, couldn't wait to get to something new. But I was still excited about the idea of doing something new when I was done with it. So I'm not necessarily saying I'm completely done with it. It ends in a way that there's an opportunity for more adventures and stuff like that for the merman characters. But I did, complete my mission of the 5 books that I pitched, and so that feels really good. Um, but yeah, so it's kind of open ended. I don't have any plans at this time to make anything new, but I wouldn't be necessarily opposed to it.
No, that's fun. I'm sure the people who have loved your characters would be glad to hear that as well, to be able to go back to that world. It's hard when they end sometimes.
Yeah.
Um, your newest graphic novel, Ghost Hog, you've talked a little bit about it. It's coming out in May of next year, and the other than your central character, who is maybe less cranky than you thought it would be, is it a very fantastical world like Merman and Undersea World, or is it a world that is built more what on land and in a familiar
It
place?
is a bit, it's actually more fantastic than the Merman world. The Merman world, the later volumes take place in this undersea
Hmm.
world that's happening kind of secretly to our world. It starts out on land and Merman interacting with like what we would think of as sort of like the real world, contemporary type world based on places I've actually been and things like that. And then you dive into this sort of undersea kingdom that's different, but it still is rooted in uh, our real world. But with Ghost Hog, that's something I wanted to do is create a completely new fantasy world that doesn't necessarily correlate to any real place or time. It has a sort of vaguely ancient, vaguely fantasy type setting, but I try to not have as many rules as I did with Merman. That was the thing that I had a little bit more restrictions on, that it was still set in the real world, even if there was this sort of like fantasy element. So that's something that's really been fun about Ghost Hog, and the possibility of not necessarily like Ghost Dog is a self-contained book, but I think I may be doing more books that are also self-contained within that world,
Mm,
and that's a fun idea, I think, too. And so that's something that I have a lot of possibilities to play with.
that's exciting. World building takes a lot of time. And
Mm.
did you think in terms of building the world first, or did you start with the characters?
I started with the characters. It just came from a sketch of a little ghost pig years ago, just in my sketchbook. And then I sort of sat in the back of my mind. I tried not to think about it too much because I didn't want to lose interest in working on Merman. But it was there a little bit. And as I kind of thought about it, it started forming more and more. And it did end up sort of taking place in this fantasy world. There are some human characters that kind of come in and out of it, but it's mostly focused on sort of semi anthropomorphized animals and forest spirits and things like that.
Mm, that's exciting. That's really fun. Um, can you tell me what you would tell yourself if you were to look back before
Hmm.
you were published, before you had your first opportunity? What would you tell yourself in terms of advice in breaking into graphic novels, writing for middle grade, anything that you think would have been helpful to you to know?
Oh gosh, yeah, that's a hard thing to say. When I'm giving just general advice for people, I just tell them to start small. Don't start with the big epic story. But that is sort of what I did, is started with small short stories and things like that. Um, I'd say I don't know. This is something I have to think about for a second. Sorry. Um, I would say to sort of just reassure myself that if I keep working on what I believe in, that I will eventually, be at the spot where I can make my own books. I think there was a lot of times that I was not sure if I was going to be able to be published, or when I was working on a book, not sure if I'd ever have another new idea ever again and things like that. And it is nice to now be farther in the future and see that road behind me. And so, yeah, I would just reassure myself that if I just keep working, I will create work that I like, and others will come to it.
Yeah. And the ideas will come, more ideas.
Oh,
That's
yeah.
that's that's good to hear. I'm sure every writer needs to hear that sometimes, that new ideas will come. So, I have just one more question for you. And what I would like to know is, when you are in the process of writing your graphic novels and you are kind of moving through them. I know your very first graphic novel, I think I read in an interview that you did, that it started out as a series of 5 shorter comic books. That's how you imagined it, and then
hmm
that developed into 5 chapters for each of
hmm
your
Yeah, for
um,
the first Merman book. Yeah.
yeah, for the first Merman book. And so I wondered if, when you are writing now, if you still follow that same kind of process, or if you allow yourself to be open to a different process or a different um, style of development, or if that has stayed consistent for you.
Yeah, so I that stayed consistent throughout the Merman series. I ended up staying with that format of I think they all have 5 chapters. As far as I can recall, yeah, they all have 5 chapters and all have a similar structure in that way, and that was kind of a good way to work on pacing and things like that, and take a little bit of the decision making out of my hands, and just worry about the story and stuff, and be able to sort of have this format that I could work with. But with Ghost Hog, I wanted to do something completely new, or break out from what I had been doing with the Merman books. So I returned to what I had done with my previous books before Merman, where it was just one long story with no like definite chapter breaks and things like that. But I tried to incorporate what I'd learned from doing chapters, with being sort of being sure that every small chunk of pages, there's still a lot of compelling things happening, and that the story is pushing forward, and that it's written in a way that will, without this definite structure of being like end of chapter 1, dun dun dun, don't you want to see what happens in chapter 2, still kind of having a little bit of those structure where it makes you want to keep pushing forward, even though Ghost Hog is just one long story, one narrative story without those big breaks in them.
You also, one more thing, because I had forgotten about this, and this is something that interests me as well. You have written for the Star Wars franchise as well. How is writing for a different franchise
Yeah,
different?
well, I will clarify. I've done coloring for the Star Wars
Oh, it's
books,
coloring.
so I'm not doing the writing for that. But I have written for the SpongeBob comics. So along those same lines, it's interesting. It's kind of fun to be able to, play with someone else's toys or whatever.
Yeah.
When I first got that opportunity to work on the SpongeBob comic book, I watched a bunch of SpongeBob episodes and kind of got in that mindset. And every once in a while, I will still, I think, write SpongeBob a little bit too much. I think I have my own way of looking at a main character, and he's maybe a little bit more subdued than the SpongeBob character is. So
Mhm.
sometimes my editor would be like, "Well, why does it have to be these characters that are doing that?" And that's something that he kept kind of harping on earlier on when I was working, and it really did make me sort of realize that what I have to do when I'm writing for those characters is realize what makes them special and individual, and work with those traits, rather than just create whatever kind of story I want and then plug those characters in. You really have to think about the fact that that people like these characters for a reason, and that that is actually the strength of what those properties have that you can work with.
It sounds like it might be a relief, interesting and a great learning experience to work with others' characters, but a kind of a relief to go back to your own characters, where that belongs, where it all belongs to you.
Yeah, I think the SpongeBob thing I think of as being very fun, and I'm very proud of those comics, but they don't feel like they're mine, the same
Mhm.
way that my comics feel very close to me. The SpongeBob comics do feel close to me in the sense that a lot of times, just to like mine ideas, I think about my own life, and so a lot of times they'll reflect on things that are happening to me right now that I think are funny or something. but there's always a little bit of that wall that they're not something that I created from the beginning, and they're not exactly the same. I don't have the same relationship to them that I do with Merman and Ghost Hog and things like that.
Right. They belong to you, those characters.
Hmm.
Well, I so appreciate your time with talking to us. For everyone, please go and enjoy Joey Weiser's Merman series. There are 5 graphic novels available in that series, and Ghost Hog, which will be out in May of 2019. They are absolutely charming, wonderful stories, and fantastic art. I really appreciate your time and
Oh,
talking to
thank
us
you.
today.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me. This was fun.
Good. Have a wonderful day.
Thanks. You too. All right.